My name is Luke Hart, and I'm passionate about social mobility, but I often find it's missing from diversity conversations. So I decided to fill in the gap. I recently completed a leadership master's, and I focused my dissertation on the class ceiling in the UK. The fact that those from poorer backgrounds are much less likely to reach leadership positions. And so I'd like to talk to you today about what I've learned about social mobility and the class ceiling, so that you can understand the incredible potential of the socially mobile and how we unlock it. First, a question. What economic class do you believe that you came from? Well, did you know that in the UK, a quarter of people from middle-class backgrounds consider themselves working class when they're not? That's 3.5 million people. Let's try to understand why this area is so misunderstood. When we talk about social mobility, there are two types: absolute mobility and relative mobility. Absolute mobility is where you've improved your socioeconomic status over your parents. So, if your parents earned 20 grand a year and you earn 25 grand a year, inflation adjusted, then you've experienced absolute mobility. Absolute mobility is a measure of general progress in an economy. So if the economy progresses and the benefits are shared, then everyone can be absolutely mobile. Relative mobility, on the other hand, is where you've improved your position in the socioeconomic hierarchy against your peers versus your parents' position in the socioeconomic hierarchy against their peers. So, if your parents were born in the bottom 10% of income and you join the top 10% of income, then you've experienced relative mobility. Normally, when people are talking about social mobility, they're talking about relative mobility, which is how easily people who are competent are able to move above those who are born to a higher socioeconomic status. So, relative mobility is considered a measure of general fairness in an economy. But what are the consequences of poor social mobility? Well, one is the class pay gap, where those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have lower pay compared to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And the bit that I investigated is the class ceiling, the underrepresentation of leaders from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. First, let's look at how social mobility has changed in the UK across time. So, for the last couple of hundred years, relative mobility has been consistently low. However, there have been quite dramatic changes in absolute mobility. One of the really big examples was post-World War II, when there was a massive increase in absolute mobility because the manufacturing economy had expanded during the war and to rebuild afterwards, and wages had also increased because so many had died in the war. So, in the immediate generations after World War II, they experienced high levels of absolute mobility as new high-quality jobs arrived in their communities, and those communities became wealthier. But that didn't last. For those born since the 1970s, and specifically for those that joined the workforce after 2008, absolute mobility has declined precipitously. In fact, the last time it was this low was prior to World War II in the 1930s. And so, social mobility is now increasingly limited to relative mobility, where individuals must leave the working class communities they grew up in and move to middle class communities where the good jobs are concentrated. And these isolated social mobility journeys can lead the socially mobile today to suffer with increased rates of mental health conditions, because they often feel a sense of alienation from both their origin community and their destination community. So what is class? Class is a complex term. If we go back to industrial economies, however, it was quite simple. Class was determined, as Karl Marx said, by your relation to the means of production. This means that if you owned the land that the factory is built on, you were an upper-class aristocrat. If you owned the factory, you were an upper-class capitalist. If you ran the factory, you were a middle-class manager. And if you worked in the factory or worked on the land, you were working class, a proletariat or a peasant. Defining class has become harder now that we've moved to a service economy, where a lot of wealth is generated from knowledge work. Class is now determined based on a mixture of different types of capital. Economic capital, how much money your family has. Educational capital, your highest educational attainment. Cultural capital, the parts of your personality that are shaped by and valued by your community. And social capital, the friends and networks that you build, often through shared cultural capital. When we're thinking about the class ceiling, social and cultural capital are particularly interesting. Social capital isn't just how big your social network is, but also how valuable each of those connections are. In working class communities, even if you have lots of friends, they're unlikely to be able to provide you with financial support, educational support, or productive work opportunities. Cultural capital is really important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, cultural capital can be inclusionary because it enables you to form relationships more easily and deeply with those that you share cultural capital with. However, it can also be used to discriminate because it enables you to distinguish where people are in the socioeconomic hierarchy. And so, there's a feedback loop between cultural capital and social capital. If you're initially similar to others, this feedback loop can be inclusionary. But if you're initially different to others, it can be exclusionary. And this poses challenges for the socially mobile when they move to professional workplaces where their peers are overwhelmingly from middle-class backgrounds. So, the class pay gap. This is the problem in numbers. In the UK, the class pay gap is 31%, which is more than double the gender pay gap of 15%. And, as you can see from this class ceiling data, being from a poor background is a greater disadvantage to achieving a leadership position versus gender too. As you progress through your career, the impact of your background doesn't diminish. In fact, it grows. The class pay gap is greater in professional occupations because the further up the hierarchy that you progress, the more different your social and cultural capital is compared to your peers. So if you made it into a professional occupation and you're from a working class background, currently you're being paid 18% less than someone from a professional background. So why does this matter? First of all, there's increasing advocacy around social mobility. COVID has clearly shown that economic disparities have a big impact on life chances. In 2019, 31% of people said companies should do more on social mobility, and that jumped to 42% over just 2 years. In many studies, the socially mobile have been shown to have more developed characters from those from richer backgrounds. Growing up poor often instills resilience, empathy, and gratitude in the socially mobile as a consequence of experiencing adversity. And by embarking on the social mobility journey, they develop creativity, determination, and growth-mindedness by steering their lives beyond the path that society prescribes for them. And because of their unique characteristics, the socially mobile have been shown to be better than average leaders. One of the key reasons for this is they're more likely to favour a more supportive leadership style, which puts others first. This is because they've learned to navigate different social groups during their social mobility journey, and so they're highly effective at unifying diverse groups into inclusive teams. So how does addressing social mobility help businesses? Organisations which hire and promote the socially mobile experience less crises, they're more innovative, and they have higher agility. This is because the socially mobile are often excellently positioned to help organisations see threats and to respond to them. Adversity has often taught them to effectively perceive risks in their environment, and their social mobility journey has taught them to find creative solutions to problems. On top of this, low social mobility also comes at a cost of approximately £13 billion a year in the UK. This is because low social mobility means that, as a society, we don't get the best doctors, politicians, and CEOs, because those raised poor but with natural aptitude often don't get the opportunity to develop their potential, which would benefit us all, and so we all suffer. Low social mobility also creates high economic inequality, which in turn leads to worse outcomes across a whole range of measures in society. Interestingly, it isn't just the poor that suffer. If you're a rich person in a highly economically unequal country, you do worse on a whole range of measures versus someone who's poorer in a more equal country. For example, life expectancy, literacy, homicides, obesity, and mental illness are all worse for everyone in highly economically unequal societies. So everyone benefits from living in a country where the best people get the best jobs, and where we're all given a fair chance of succeeding from the beginning. Yet, that's not the case in the UK, where socioeconomic status is more strongly inherited than height. Your parents' socioeconomic status has a continuing influence on your educational performance and your earnings throughout your life. This impact grows across your lifespan. In fact, rich children with low cognitive ability are 35% more likely to be high earners than poor children with high ability. And this gap has grown 40% in 30 years. So why is there such a problem with social mobility in the UK? Well, this country has one of the lowest social mobility rates of any developed country. 33% of the population is working class, but only 1/10 of those make it into elite occupations, compared to 1/3 of those from high socioeconomic backgrounds. As I mentioned, absolute mobility has been declining for those born since the 1970s. A number of economic and political factors have contributed, but the financial crisis in 2008 had a significant impact. So what is the story for those that joined the workforce after 2008? Well, firstly, it will be 2026 before wages reach 2008 levels. Rents and house prices are significantly higher in comparison to wages than for previous generations, eroding young people's ability to save. And so millennials now have 40% less wealth than their parents at the same age. As a consequence, inheritances are increasingly determining socioeconomic status later in life. Those from the richest fifth of backgrounds inherit around 30% of their lifetime earnings, while those from the poorest fifth essentially don't inherit anything. And these growing disparities in unearned wealth create intergenerational barriers to social mobility. So, for those born since the 1970s, the ladder has been lifted up, and the steps on the ladder are moving further and further apart, making social mobility an increasingly rare journey. So, I look to understand how the challenges that the socially mobile experienced across their life trajectory might contribute to the class ceiling. I began by investigating upbringing and, firstly, approaches to parenting. There are stark differences right at the beginning of life with regards to how the working classes and the middle classes parent. In poor communities, there is what's called natural growth parenting, where nature does the rearing, as the parents are often too busy or they're too stressed with making ends meet, and so are often more hands-off with their children's development. It's also characterized by a more commanding parenting, with harsher punishments, because parents might be trying to protect their children from falling into bad paths. This style of parenting can mean that the socially mobile aren't comfortable around authority figures, and they don't expect them to play a role in their career development. In contrast, middle-class communities utilize a parenting approach called concerted cultivation. Here, parents play a very active role in rearing their children. They talk to them as equals, with interest. They're often softer with their children, and they put a lot of energy and resources into their children's development, mitigating their weaknesses, say through tutoring, and developing their interests, say through extracurriculars. Conversely then, those from middle-class backgrounds are often much more comfortable around authority figures, and they expect those authority figures to play a role in their career development. Then there's school expectations. Schools in poor communities usually aren't trying to self-actualize their students in the way that schools in middle-class communities might be. Instead, these schools are trying to keep children on the straight and narrow and out of desperate life situations. So, they focus on helping children achieve minimum standards. However, these low expectations lead to what is known as the Golem effect. The Golem effect states that if others hold low expectations for you, then you develop low self-belief. And this leads to lower performance because your ambition is reduced. And finally, interaction with peers. In poor communities, the community fabric is often seen as more important than any single individual. Because if you haven't got the economic resources to live independently, then everyone is dependent on each other. But if an individual rises above the community, then they can be perceived as a threat to the community. If you're highly intelligent, as the socially mobile are, you are a tall poppy. And the tall poppy is the first one that gets cut down. That's what tall poppy syndrome is. If you're doing really well at a school in a poor community, you may be bullied by your peers because of your success. Because those successes can be seen as a threat to the community fabric. So you hide your ambition, you hide your capability, and you talk yourself down. This bullying also means you're less likely to socialize with your peers because they can be antagonistic towards your achievements. The consequence of tall poppy syndrome is that the more capable the socially mobile are, the less likely they are to develop a leadership identity because they've often been rejected by or pulled away from social circles in order to succeed academically. So let's assume the socially mobile have overcome the challenges of their upbringing and they're now starting their careers in a professional organisation. These are the common hurdles the socially mobile will have to face next. Firstly, role definition. Professional roles are often defined in terms of middle-class cultural capital. What we think of as competence, as potential, and as ambition in professional organisations are often just reflections of middle-class norms and ideals, such as your mannerisms, and can be irrelevant to performance. Secondly, access to roles. 21% of people say it was their social networks rather than their competence that got them their role. This poses challenges for the socially mobile, given that they lack middle-class contacts, and so merit is their only opportunity to get their foot in the door. Then there's CV screening. Discrimination plays a strong role in filtering out the socially mobile. Elite employers invite men from a lower socioeconomic background to interview 13 times less than those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, even when there is no difference between education and work experience. The only difference is cultural capital, irrelevant things like different schools and different hobbies. And finally, unconscious biases. So even if the socially mobile manage to hurdle their way into professional occupations, their lack of middle-class cultural capital continues to hold them back. The socially mobile are viewed as less competent, less ambitious, and less committed in their jobs by those from middle-class backgrounds. And this is a major problem when 51% of people say that social capital is more important than competence for promotion in their organisation. So how do all of these factors unfold in terms of the socially mobile developing into leaders? Let's start by looking at how they build a reputation at work. When the socially mobile begin their professional careers, they often find they're in a social environment where they don't have the cultural capital to form lots of relationships easily. So they feel a bit alienated, and they repeat the same strategy that got them there in the first place. They tend to avoid building social networks and self-advocating, and instead, they get their heads down and focus on developing a reputation for technical competence. This strategy leads the socially mobile to self-select and be directed by others into technical roles from the very beginning of their careers. And this is in contrast to those from middle-class backgrounds who have the social and cultural capital which is valued in professional workplaces. The impact is that the socially mobile are less likely to be developed as leaders in their careers. They're less likely to get sponsored or get training, and so they progress 25% slower. When the socially mobile want to progress their careers, they continue to focus heavily on developing competence in their current role, and they await their manager initiating the promotion conversation. Meanwhile, those from middle-class backgrounds are often more likely to expand out of their role, to self-advocate and utilize social capital to achieve promotion. Despite the class ceiling, when they do reach leadership positions, the socially mobile are rated as better than average leaders. So the challenge is, how do we encourage the socially mobile to recognize themselves as leaders and for others to recognize them as leaders too? In my dissertation, I focused on the psychological barriers that the socially mobile can overcome to improve their leadership success. What came out of my research was that in their careers, the socially mobile are often more likely to play not to lose rather than to play to win, because of a defensive mentality that's developed in childhood. And this can mean that those that might otherwise be very competent leaders can hold themselves back. Two key factors that explain this are a stronger fear of failure and self-limiting beliefs. A stronger fear of failure comes from the sense that the world is a dangerous place. Because of their poorer upbringing, where failure and mistakes had serious consequences, the socially mobile are often more likely to focus on mitigating risks rather than exploiting opportunities in their careers. Harsher parenting and punishments during upbringing can mean that the socially mobile are often particularly afraid of making mistakes and therefore prefer to keep their distance from authority figures. Self-limiting beliefs come from the sense that the challenges you face in life are too big for you to surmount. Growing up in a poor community can lead to a feeling of powerlessness. You often don't get what you want because there isn't enough money, opportunity, or support. And adversity can shape your life in ways that are out of your control. And so, the socially mobile can feel that they don't have agency in their lives. This is then compounded with the Gollum effect and the tall poppy syndrome, which limit their leadership ambitions. So how can these psychological barriers to the class ceiling be overcome? I interviewed 13 socially mobile leaders at BP in the UK to find out. And it turned out that successful journeys often overlapped with what's called the authentic leadership emergence model. The first factor that's required for leadership emergence is an authentic identity. The problem for the socially mobile is that they've never really fitted in. They've stood out in their origin community as a tall poppy, and they've arrived in a middle-class community where they quickly develop imposter syndrome. The solution is for the socially mobile to stop trying to fit in and instead to develop an authentic identity. To grow, they then need to develop positive psychological traits. These are confidence, hope, optimism, and resilience, which are important for overcoming the fear of failure and those self-limiting beliefs. Critical life events are then necessary for a leadership identity to emerge. And these are often traumatic or difficult, but they have to be, because they need to push an individual beyond those self-limiting beliefs to shift their thinking from, I'm not a leader, to I could lead, to I am a leader. So, where from here? My research showed the socially mobile are an incredible untapped resource. And I hope you now understand why it's important. I hope you're energized to do your bit to make the world a fairer and a better place for all of us. Thank you so much for listening.